It is the morning of January 20th, 1963, and inside a terraced house in the north of England, the silence is deafening. You wake up not to the sound of traffic or the milk float, but to a stillness so heavy it feels like a weight on your chest. You are buried under a mountain of bedding, sheets, wool blankets, a heavy eiderdown, and perhaps even an old winter coat thrown on top for good measure. But you can still feel it. The air in the bedroom is so cold that your breath forms a thick white cloud in front of your face, hanging there like cigarette smoke. You slide your arm out from the warmth to reach for a glass of water on the bedside table, only to find it solid, a block of ice frozen hard in the tumbler. You swing your legs out of bed, and your feet hit the linoleum floor with a shock that travels straight up your spine. But the true horror awaits at the window. You pull back the thin curtain to check the weather, but you can't see out. The glass is covered in thick, fern-like patterns of ice. Not on the outside, but on the inside. You scratch at it with a fingernail, scraping away the frost to reveal a world that has vanished. The street, the pavement, and the garden walls are gone, buried under a relentless, blinding white blanket that hasn't stopped falling for weeks. This isn't just winter, this is a siege. To understand why the winter of 1963 brought a modern industrial nation to its knees, we must first step back and look at the stage upon which this icy tragedy was played. The Great Britain of the early 1960s was a country perched precariously between the past and the future. We had nuclear power stations and jet airliners, yet the vast majority of the population was living in housing conditions that had barely changed since the reign of Queen Victoria. We must strip away the modern luxuries we take for granted today. In 1962, central heating was not a standard feature. It was an unimaginable luxury reserved for the very wealthy or the ultra-modern. For 90% of the population, the concept of a warm house was a fantasy. A home in 1962 was not a sealed, insulated, climate-controlled box. It was, essentially, a brick tent with windows. The average working-class home, whether it was a terraced house in Manchester, a tenement in Glasgow, or a semi-detached in the London suburbs, relied on a single source of heat: the coal fire in the living room. This open hearth was the beating heart of the house, the altar around which the family life revolved. But it was a fickle god. It roasted your shins while the draft from the door froze your back. It required constant feeding, constant riddling, and constant cleaning, and crucially, its warmth was strictly local. Step out of that living room, and you entered a different climate zone. The hallway was a refrigerator. The kitchen, often a scullery with a stone floor, was damp and chilly. And the bedrooms upstairs were little more than ice boxes. Going to bed in 1962 wasn't just about sleep, it was a tactical operation. You wore pajamas, maybe a vest underneath, and socks. You relied on hot water bottles, rubber bladders filled from the kettle, that was slid between the freezing cotton sheets half an hour before you dared to climb in. And once you were in, you didn't move. You lay perfectly still, preserving the small pocket of body heat you had generated, listening to the wind rattle the single pane of glass that was the only barrier between you and the elements. Double glazing was practically science fiction. The windows in millions of British homes were sash timber frames that had warped over decades, or metal crittle windows that conducted the cold straight into the room. They didn't keep the weather out, they merely filtered it. If the wind blew from the east, the curtains would move even when the window was shut. But the greatest weakness of the British home in 1963 lay in its plumbing. In a staggering number of properties, estimates suggest over 25% in some cities, the toilet was still outside. It was a brick shed at the bottom of the yard or attached to the back kitchen. To use the facilities in the middle of the night meant putting on a coat and boots and braving the elements. Even in homes with indoor bathrooms, the pipes were often routed along outside walls with zero insulation. The water tank was in the loft, unlagged and exposed to the biting wind whistling under the eaves. We were a nation built on coal and brick, confident in our mild, wet, maritime climate. We built our houses to breathe, to let the air circulate to prevent rot, never dreaming that nature was about to turn that ventilation into a weapon. We were a population that prided ourselves on making do, on wearing an extra jumper rather than turning up a thermostat that didn't exist. But as December 1962 drew to a close, the housing stock of Great Britain was sitting like a row of sitting ducks, utterly undefended against an assault from the Arctic that would test the national resolve to its breaking point. The blow, when it finally landed, struck with the precision of a military ambush. Christmas Day 1962 had been deceptive. Cold, certainly, with a dusting of snow in Glasgow, but for the rest of the country, it was merely grey and shivering. Families sat down to their turkey dinners, completely unaware that the meteorological map over Europe was shifting into a formation not seen for 200 years. On Boxing Day evening, the rain began to fall across the south of England. But as the temperature plummeted, the rain turned. It didn't just turn to sleet. It thickened into heavy, relentless flakes the size of saucers. A massive anticyclone, a high-pressure system, had anchored itself near Iceland, while another sat over Russia. Between them they blocked the warm, wet westerly winds that usually keep Britain mild. In their place, they opened the door to a freezing, biting easterly wind that dragged the breath of Siberia straight across the North Sea. This wasn't a flurry, it was a burial. By the morning of December 27th, the south of England was covered in over a foot of snow. Drifts in Kent reached 8 feet high, but unlike typical British snow, which turns to grey slush within 24 hours, this snow didn't melt. The temperature didn't rise above freezing. It stayed, and then it snowed again, and again. The paralysis was instantaneous and total. The British transport network, the arteries of the nation, simply seized up. The steam trains, the mighty iron horses that had kept the country moving through 2 world wars, froze in their tracks. Points seized solid, water towers turned to blocks of ice, and coal froze in the tenders. On the roads, the situation was apocalyptic. The motorway network was in its infancy. The M1 had only been open for a few years, and it vanished completely under the white blanket. Lorries jackknifed, blocking key routes for days. The A roads, the lifelines to rural villages, became impassable trenches of white. Abandoned cars littered the verges, buried until only their aerials were visible, looking like strange metal plants growing in a frozen wasteland. For the first time in centuries, the bustling, industrial noise of Great Britain was silenced. There were no engines, no wheels turning, no movement, just the howling of the easterly wind and the terrified realization that this wasn't going to end in a few days. The country had been effectively turned off. The battle for survival began before you even stepped out the front door. It started in the kitchen. For millions of housewives, when the morning routine became a desperate struggle against physics. You would go to the sink to fill the kettle, turn the tap, and hear nothing but a hollow, mocking clank. The pipes were frozen solid. This led to a dangerous daily ritual that terrified fire brigades across the country. Fathers would descend under the sink or climb into the loft, armed with a blowtorch or a candle, gently heating the lead pipes in a frantic attempt to get the water flowing again. If you were lucky, you got a trickle. If you were unlucky, the thawed water would burst through a split in the pipe, flooding a kitchen that was already below freezing. Then there was the milkman, a hero in an electric float, still battled through the snow to deliver the pints to the doorstep. But within minutes of landing on the stone step, the milk would freeze. The expanding liquid would push the foil cap upwards, creating a 2-inch column of frozen cream sticking out of the top of the bottle like a white top hat. You had to bring it inside and thaw it in a saucepan of warm water just to get it liquid enough for your tea. To combat the cold in rooms without a coal fire, Britain turned to the Aladdin pink. The paraffin heater became the smell of the winter of '63. It was a metal cylinder filled with pink kerosene that emitted a fierce, dry heat and a distinct, oily stench that clung to your clothes and the curtains. You huddled around it in the bathroom or the hallway, risking headaches from the fumes, just to feel sensation return to your toes. It was a primitive, smelly warmth, but in a house that felt like a walk-in freezer, it was a lifesaver. If the paraffin heater was the emergency reserve, the coal fire was the life support system. But in January 1963, the black diamonds that powered the nation began to run out. The problem wasn't a lack of coal underground. It was that the coal above ground was frozen solid. In the railway sidings of Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, thousands of tons of coal sat in open wagons, transformed by the frost into solid, immovable blocks of black ice. They couldn't be tipped. They had to be attacked with pickaxes and flamethrowers just to loosen the load. Suddenly, the local coal man became the most important man in the village, more vital than the doctor or the priest. When his flatbed lorry struggled up the street, slipping and sliding on the packed ice, curtains twitched in every house. People ran out with sacks, old prams and buckets, begging for a delivery. Rationing was unofficial, but brutal. You might order 5 sacks and be grateful for one. This scarcity drove people to desperation. At local gas works, where coke, a byproduct of gas production, was sold cheaply, queues stretched for miles in the biting wind. Men stood for 4 hours in the snow, stamping their feet, just to fill a pram with coke dust to keep the home fires burning. In the parks and woodlands, fallen branches disappeared overnight. Anything that could burn was fair game. For the rural communities, the isolation was absolute. In places like Dartmoor, the Peak District, and the Welsh valleys, the snowdrifts weren't measured in inches, but in feet. Villages were cut off from the outside world for weeks. The roads were buried so deep that the tops of telegraph poles were barely visible. It was here that the famous images of the winter were born. RAF helicopters, usually machines of war, dropping bales of hay to starving cattle stranded in fields that had become white deserts. Farmers had to dig tunnels through the snow to reach their livestock, emerging into barns where the water troughs had to be smashed open with sledgehammers every morning. It was a return to a pre-industrial existence, where survival depended entirely on what you had in the pantry and how well you knew your neighbors. The moment the British public realized that this was not just a spell of bad weather, but a terrifying meteorological anomaly, came when the impossible happened. The island stopped being an island. The sea itself began to freeze. To stand on the promenade at Herne Bay in Kent in late January 1963 was to stare at an alien planet. Usually the sound of the British coast is the rhythmic crashing of grey waves on shingle. But now there was silence. Stretching out from the beach, mile after jagged mile, was a solid sheet of white ice. The sea had not just frozen, it had been caught in motion. Great waves had been turned into sculptures of ice, frozen mid-break, creating a chaotic, tumbled lunar landscape where seagulls usually flew. Brave, or perhaps foolish, locals walked out onto the ocean. Photographs from the time show families standing a mile offshore, bundled in coats and scarves, posing on the frozen waves as if they were exploring the Arctic. It was a sight that defied all logic. We are a maritime nation. The sea is our constant, moving border. To see it solid, motionless and silent, shook the national psyche to its core. It wasn't just the coast. Inland, the great rivers that powered British commerce ground to a halt. The River Thames, the busy artery of London, froze solid in its upper reaches. Between Oxford and Reading, the river became a highway of ice. At Windsor, people walked across the ice in the shadow of the castle, recreating scenes from the frost fairs of the 1800s. Events that were supposed to be ancient history, belonging to the little ice age of Dickens, not the modern age of the Beatles. In the countryside, the landscape had lost all definition. Hedges, walls, and roads had vanished under snowdrifts that were 20 feet deep. The snow had been packed so hard by the relentless wind that you could walk on top of hedges without sinking. Cars that had been abandoned weeks earlier were now completely invisible, just humps in the white terrain. It was a blank white canvas where the familiar landmarks of home had been erased. The temperature fell to 20.2 degrees, 8 degrees in Braemar, Scotland, and even in the south, it regularly dropped below 15 degrees. This was no longer Great Britain. It felt as though the entire country had been physically towed north and anchored off the coast of Norway. As the freeze dragged into February, the infrastructure that underpinned modern life began to collapse under the strain. The national grid, the invisible web of power that kept the lights on, was pushed to its breaking point. The demand for electricity was unprecedented as millions of electric fires were switched on simultaneously in a desperate bid for warmth. But the power stations themselves were failing. Coal, frozen solid in the yards, couldn't be loaded into the furnaces fast enough. Cooling towers iced over. The pylons that marched across the countryside grew heavy with tons of accumulated ice, the cables sagging dangerously low until they snapped under the weight, plunging entire counties into darkness. The government, terrified of a total blackout, introduced voltage reductions. It was a subtle, eerie phenomenon. In the evenings, as you sat trying to read or knit, the light bulb above your head would dim. The television picture would shrink, the image contracting into a small, fuzzy square in the center of the screen. It was a visual reminder that the system was dying. In some areas, rolling blackouts were enforced. You would sit in the dark, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind howl, waiting for the power to return so you could boil a kettle. The gas supply was even more precarious. The town gas, used in 1963, was wet. It contained moisture. As it traveled through the shallow, uninsulated pipes under the streets, that moisture froze, blocking the supply. In hundreds of thousands of homes, the gas pressure dropped until the flame on the cooker was nothing more than a flickering blue ghost, useless for cooking or heating. Industry ground to a halt. Building sites were silent graveyards of frozen mud and machinery. Factories closed because their water supplies were solid ice. Unemployment skyrocketed as over 150,000 construction workers were laid off. The grand promise of the post-war technological age, that we had conquered nature with our machines, was exposed as a lie. We were cold, we were in the dark, and we were running out of fuel. The nation was surviving on stubbornness alone. The Dunkirk spirit was invoked by politicians, but huddled in a freezing kitchen with no gas and dimmed lights, it felt less like heroism and more like grim, shivering endurance. The end of the siege did not come with a fanfare, nor did the sun suddenly blaze down to save the nation. It came with a subtle shift in the wind. On the morning of March 6, 1963, for the first time in nearly 10 weeks, the air that brushed against the cheek didn't bite. The high-pressure system that had held Britain in a stranglehold finally collapsed, and the familiar, damp westerly winds from the Atlantic rushed in to reclaim the island. But relief was almost instantly replaced by a new form of chaos. As the temperature climbed gingerly above freezing, the great thaw began, and with it came the sound that would haunt householders for years to come, the rhythmic, terrifying drip, drip, drip of water. During the freeze, millions of gallons of water had turned to ice inside copper and lead pipes, expanding and splitting the metal with the force of a geological event. The ice had acted as a plug, holding the water back. But as the thaw set in, those plugs melted. Simultaneously, across the country, millions of pipes began to spray water. It happened in the middle of the night. You would wake to the sound of rushing water, not from a tap, but from the ceiling. In thousands of homes, the lath and plaster ceilings, heavy with sodden insulation and water, simply gave way, crashing down into bedrooms and living rooms in a slurry of gray sludge and broken plaster. Staircases turned into waterfalls. The pride of the British home, the patterned Axminster carpet, was turned into a soggy, stinking sponge. Plumbers became instantly more valuable than gold dust. You couldn't hire one for love nor money. They were booked up until May, desperate fathers and husbands, armed with nothing but enthusiasm and ignorance, attempted DIY repairs, wrapping split pipes in bandages, old rags and mastic, often making the problem 10 times worse. The insurance companies were overwhelmed. The total cost of the damage to British housing stock was estimated at over 20 million, a staggering sum in 1963 money. Outside, the romance of the white winter evaporated instantly. As the snow melted, it didn't reveal a green and pleasant land. It revealed a country that looked like a landfill site. For 3 months, rubbish collections had been sporadic or non-existent. The snow had hidden the debris, the litter, and the abandoned cars. Now, as the white blanket receded, it left behind a landscape of grey slush, rotting vegetation, and the carcasses of thousands of dead birds and livestock that had succumbed to the cold. The roads, having been frozen and thawed repeatedly, disintegrated. Potholes the size of bomb craters opened up on major highways. The tarmac crumbled away, leaving dirt tracks where A roads used to be. The country emerged from the ice looking battered, dirty, and broken. However, the most lasting legacy of the Big Freeze wasn't the repair bill. It was a fundamental shift in the British psyche. The winter of 1963 didn't just break pipes, it broke the British acceptance of the cold. For generations, we had worn our suffering like a badge of honor. We believed that waking up with ice on the inside of the windows built character, and that central heating was something soft that Americans had. But 3 months of shivering in our own kitchens had shattered that illusion. We realized that freezing to death in our own homes wasn't noble, it was unnecessary. The years following 1963 saw a revolution in the British home. The Parker-Morris Standards, a new set of rules for social housing, began to mandate that new council homes must be heated to a certain temperature. It was a radical idea that a working-class family had the right to be warm in more than one room. This was the dawn of the age of central heating. It didn't happen overnight, but the memory of '63 was the driving force. Suddenly, the most desirable feature in a house wasn't a garden or a bay window. It was the humble radiator. The gas industry launched massive marketing campaigns. High-speed gas, promising a world where you could walk from the lounge to the hallway without putting on a coat. The noisy, smelly paraffin heaters were retired to the shed, and the coal fire began its slow, inevitable decline. The open hearth, once the spiritual center of the home, became a victim of progress. The Clean Air Acts were already pushing for smokeless zones, but the inconvenience of the freeze sealed the deal. Who wanted to chip frozen coal out of a bunker at 6 a.m. when they could just flick a switch? The coalman, a figure as familiar as the postman, started to disappear from the streets, replaced by the gas man and the electricity meter reader. We also began to seal ourselves in. The 1960s saw the beginning of the double glazing boom. The rattling sash windows that had let the east wind whistle through were ripped out and replaced with aluminium and, later, UPVC frames. We lagged our lofts, we wrapped our tanks, and we draft-proofed our doors. We turned our brick tents into the sealed, insulated boxes we live in today. In a way, the winter of 1963 marked the end of a specific type of British toughness. We traded our stoicism for comfort. We stopped being a people who huddled together for warmth and started being individuals who could sit in T-shirts in December. It was undeniably progress, a triumph of technology over nature. But something was lost in the transition. The shared struggle of the coal fire, the communal knowledge of how to bank a fire to keep it in all night, the sheer physical effort required to keep a home alive. All of that faded away, replaced by the silent, invisible efficiency of the thermostat. Today, whenever a few inches of snow fall on the UK, the headlines scream of chaos and travel misery. Schools close, trains are cancelled, and the 24-hour news cycle goes into meltdown. But for those old enough to remember, these modern flurries bring only a wry smile. They are nothing. They are a dusting of icing sugar compared to the frozen Leviathan that was 1963. The Big Freeze remains the gold standard of British winters, the yardstick against which all others are measured and found wanting. It stands as a monument in the national memory, not just because of the statistics, the temperatures, the depth of the drifts, the weeks of isolation, but because of how we faced it. We look back at that winter with a strange mixture of horror and affection. It was a time of immense hardship, yes. The cold was a physical pain, and the inconvenience was staggering. But it was also the last time that nature truly humbled us. In our modern world of climate control, heated seats, and global supply chains, we have forgotten what it feels like to be at the mercy of the elements. In 1963, we were reminded that we were just small, warm-blooded creatures living on a rock in the North Atlantic. Yet, we didn't break. There was no panic buying, no rioting, no social collapse. There was just a quiet, grim determination to get on with it. Neighbors dug each other out. Strangers shared coal. The milkman walked when his float couldn't drive. It was a demonstration of a specific kind of British resilience that seems to have melted away along with the snow. A stoicism born of a time when comfort wasn't a right, but a reward. The winter of 1963 was a frozen pause in history, a 10-week silence where the noise of the modern world was muffled by the snow. And while we may never want to live through it again, shivering in our beds and scraping ice from the inside of the windows, we are proud that we did. It remains a shared scar, a badge of honor for a generation who looked the Ice Age in the eye and didn't blink.